So I don't feel like this requirement was in any way too steep, and more than 2/3 of you, both classes have done it. Now, I hope I'm not preaching too far, but those of you who have not turned in a paper, well, I'm not going to track you down. All right, I hope we're clear on that. You're all adults. Check on iCollege. If you don't have a grade on iCollege and you turn the paper in and see me, we can work something out. Hopefully, you did it on a computer and saved it on a flash drive or something, and if I don't, if somewhere I've lost it, and I don't have an office here, so I'm using my car as my office, and that can get, because my wife and I sometimes trade off cars, and I sometimes drive what's hers, and sometimes she drives mine. So I can lose papers, so if I've lost one, by all means. But anyway, check, make sure you've done your assignment, and take the test. Now, if you missed a test and your average is high and you think, I don't need to make this up, you don't have to make it up. But, you know, because I do drop a low score. Even though for most of you it'd be advantageous to try to make it up because it can't hurt the grade. If it's the low score to be dropped, if it's the high score, you don't realize how much it'll raise your grade if it happens to be a higher score than your low one. Because not only will I average in your higher score, I'll drop the other low score, and that can make a difference in the whole letter. So check to see that you've done all your. Now, for the pass, again, I'm only required 2. I'm supposed to require 3. I'm only required 2, but if you have not done 2 passes, see me about it. We can work something out. But make sure, I mean, you're all adults. I'm not going to track you down. I mean, you know, and say, hey, you need to do a pass, or you need to turn in a paper. I mean, if you haven't done it, you'll get a 0 for the lack of assignment. All right, hopefully now we're all clear on that now. And actually, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir because I believe everybody in the sound of my voice right now has done all their work, taken all their tests, required tests. I believe I'm right, but nevertheless, if you haven't, and again, I'll make sure that this gets on iCollege so that anybody who has missed a class can hear. I know one of your classmates is quite ill. Sorry about that, but it does happen. And some of your other classmates just make a habit of not showing up. Maybe they feel like they get on iCollege. I mean, I'm teaching a hybrid course this summer where you don't have to show up. All right. Now, anybody have any questions? About the papers. About 60% of you are open to the possibility of a nuclear war in time past. Some 40% of it had closed minds. Now, the one paper that was turned in this class, and I normally don't call names, but will this time, the one paper that I enjoyed reading the most was the one turned in by Brian Cardenas. Here's what the person said, Brian said. The best way to approach any subject with an open mind, without preconceived ideas, have an open mind, and approach a topic that way, and be prepared for any conclusion that your open mind might lead you to. I was highly impressed with that remark. Some people in the 2 classes do not seem to have any kind of an open mind at all. Also, I was a little bit disappointed in for some of you, particularly not the ones who took the atomic bomb side, but the ones who were against it. They tended to use words such as ignorant or stupid to describe your opponents. That has no place in formal academia. Writing is a social act and calls for a form of restraint. But I don't know who did that, if anyone in the sound of my voice did or not. It's not the thing that you should be doing. All right, now let me double. In both classes, there was someone in the other class who did it, but both classes, only one of you did something I did not ask for, and I did not talk if you didn't, but did something I was hoping all of you would, at least several of you would do. Both there is evidence of some kind of a nuclear war, not just at Mohenjo-Daro, but it's found all over the globe. North America, South America, Africa, and I had a student in the class last semester who knew what I've already known, that some of the desert in the Sahara, the sand is turned to glass for miles around, which again cannot happen with a meteorite explosion or a volcano or any kind of natural fire. It is simply the only thing that could have done it. Seems to have been some kind of a nuclear explosion. And of course, I did mention, and I emphasized pretty strongly, the city of Ur, Abraham's city, that it, according to their own original writings, it appears to have been destroyed in a nuclear holocaust. But the evidence is found all over the globe. Now, again, you can ridicule it. You can say that this was not peer-reviewed, and it's true. I mean, a lot of teachers will tell you this subject is not suitable for academia because academia insists that you get all the facts and can draw concrete conclusions. Well, for this topic, folks, you really cannot draw concrete conclusions because you really, it's somewhat of an open-ended topic. And there are some things we just cannot know. Now, the idea that they didn't have nuclear weapons back then, therefore nuclear warfare was impossible, I want to remind you of something. The Egyptians could not have built the Great Pyramid because they did not have the technology to move the big stones. All right, here's the logic. They were primitive back then and did not have the technology to move big stones. Therefore, the Great Pyramid could not exist. There's one thing wrong with that logic, and it should be obvious to all of you. The Great Pyramid does, in fact, exist. No matter whether it can or not, it does. And furthermore, I have heard, now I don't know how true it is, but I have heard that we do not have the technology today to move those stones, especially to raise them 480 foot high, that the stones on the top are. I've heard that we can't do it. How did they do it? They used something that we probably don't know about or don't have. They had a technique for stone moving. And it was done all over the world. I mean, it's not just the Great Pyramid. It's the Stonehenge. It's the stone at Baalbek on which Solomon's temple rests. I mean, the stone at Baalbek is the biggest man-made stone ever built. And it was not quarried there where it's located. It was moved from some location. Folk, I can tell you for sure, we don't have the technology today to move it. And it could not have been moved by rolling it on logs. How was it moved? I wish I knew. Now, back to the atomic bomb. I have been reading and listening to some people who say there's evidence that there was a nuclear war in the past that didn't just hit the Earth, but that was all over the solar system. That some of the craters on Mars are not impact craters, but they're nuclear war craters. They ask, how can you tell the difference? The nuclear warfare craters are deeper than an impact crater would be. Yes?
I've been here.
Go ahead.
So, what if, but there's life on Earth, like life on other planets? What if like back in those days, there was like a civilization on another planet, and somehow they launched atomic bombs by accident, like they were just as advanced as us, or if not further, and they sent it to our place, and it just.
I seriously doubt it would have been an accident because it appears to me that Mohenjo-Daro and Ur were targeted. All right, yes.
So there was no crater over there and there.
Speak more clearly.
How come there was no crater in Mohenjo-Daro?
Okay, in Mohenjo-Daro there is a crater. It's not as big as some people think it should be. It's there. It's called the epicenter, and everything in the crater is melted. I mean, and everything for quite a ways around it is also melted. Go ahead.
So why don't they explain it as an asteroid?
As an asteroid? Okay, here's the problem with it. We've seen asteroids fall, I mean meteors fall. One fell on Russia about 2 years ago. It was last year. And one fell in Siberia in 1908. Number one, meteorites do not leave the high level of radioactivity and do not create the extremely high temperatures that we see evident in Mohenjo-Daro. Anyway, you have a comment.
I think that was the reason when you said it was like a bunch of broken pottery in that crater. That it was from like a place where they would actually dump like pottery.
Yeah,
in there, and it was more broke. It was more of a water than petrified glass or whatever.
Yeah. Well, see, think about it. If you did be fine, down through the ages, the ancients made clay pots and dumped their pottery in garbage pits, dumps. And we put together the broken pottery, you know, and yeah. But this pottery is melted, and if you know anything about what kind of temperatures it takes to melt clay, clay has such a high melting point that we used to use clay pots to heat our iron in, because the iron would melt and the clay would remain intact. But what does it take to melt clay? I mean, not an ordinary fire.
So why of all places would you find that right there where they dump the clay, where they dump the pottery at? I mean, why couldn't they?
Well, actually, I don't think the dumping ground. I think it was just this was one part of the living place, and they had the clay pots there,
And that's what
and something hit it and melted the clay pots. But it was not a dumping. That was not their dump area.
that's so the pottery.
Yeah.
Old pottery, where they dump their old pottery, was more pottery than.
But again,
Okay,
it depends on which one you read and what you
Maybe they're
choose to
trying to
read.
dispose of the old pottery. Maybe they burned it.
Yeah.
Maybe they set it on
Well,
fire.
any ordinary fire, I mean, yeah, they would have, people do burn, we today,
Yeah.
we put stuff in a dump and burn it. But no ordinary fire will melt a clay pot. I mean, again, we melt iron in clay pots. And the iron melts and turns into liquid, and the clay doesn't. Now, there's something else that nobody picked up on. I don't expect you to have, because I mean, I've spent many, many years thinking about this. I mean, I wanted to write a paper on this back 40 years ago. I did write one paper on it. So I've spent a lot of time thinking of this long before most of you were born. But here's something else I noticed about really sinister about the city of Mohenjo-Daro. It appears that they had no king and that everybody was equal. In other words, they built this great, magnificent city and planned it all out, laid it out, and nobody had more than anybody else. Basically, a perfectly socialistic state, except unlike the American Indians, who had a social communistic state where they had nothing but teepees and wigwams to show for it. These people had an advanced civilization, and true to form, as does all socialistic states, it was declining before it was suddenly, quickly destroyed. It was in a state of decline, but we can tell that because the newer bricks are not as well built as the older bricks were. The lower down you dig, the better it gets. And again, this is true of Egyptian history, and I think true of Sumerian history. The farther down you dig, the better it gets. And folk, it should be the farther down you dig, the worse it gets. Now, there's another issue. And this, folks, most of you are going to have a hard time swallowing, but there are practically no cemeteries in Mohenjo-Daro. 47 bodies or so. Well, I mean, 37 or 44 bodies, whatever, depending on what you're reading. All right. I'm hesitant to say this, but why no more bodies? All right, because I think the city of Mohenjo-Daro, I mean, I suspect it was the city of Arata. Most of you, the name would not ring a bell. It was built right after the flood, and if you know anything about the flood, both the Sumerian and Bible, the Sumerian records, and the Vedas say that after the flood, people lived hundreds of years. The first 3 generated 400 years, followed by about 5 generations lived 200 years after the flood. Basically, nobody had died, except the ones who died and who perished in the flame or the Holocaust, whatever. So that's why you'll find no graves. Again, I don't expect you to have thought that through, but nevertheless, it's what I think. And now, of course, one reason you don't find more, I mean, you say, well, didn't the city have tens of, maybe hundreds of thousands of people? Yes, they were warned, and most of them got out. But you always have a few. I mean, we can warn people that a hurricane is coming. And a lot of people stay put. Now, most people don't, but a lot of people just stay put. And sometimes they regret it. In the city of Pompeii, they had a warning. I mean, the big mountain was bellowing for several days, and finally it just really blew its stack and covered the ones who were left. Again, why didn't the rest of them get out? They just didn't want to abandon the only home they knew and abandon all their belongings to some vandals or some thieves who would come in and try to steal them. So they perished in the city. About 6 persons remain, some 30-some persons remain, and they're the only bodies we find. No grave sites. But even, I think the city was probably inhabited for about 100 or so years, not hundreds like your books will say, but maybe 100 or so years. The reason some people think that that the bodies we found were buried at different times is if they're using radiocarbon dating. But folk, if there was a lot of radioactivity like an atomic bomb, the ones who were close to the bomb would have started off with a higher level of radioactive carbon than the ones who were farther away. That's why some bodies would have an older age than the others, because there'd be less radioactive decay for the ones that were bomb, and more radioactive decay for the ones farther away. That's why some people think, well, the ones farther away were buried much earlier than the ones, they were not all buried in the same blast. Personally, I think they were all buried in the same blast. And they were not buried they were buried over time by hundreds of years of dust and debris accumulating, because people do not make graves in the middle of a street, or even almost once a street. They'll build a new street over the old, but they don't build a cemetery on a street. And also somebody, and they've not been in this class, said, well, but the hand-holding was just a coincidence. They buried a person, then a generation later they buried maybe his wife, and by a mere coincidence they happened to be holding hands. To me, the logic is bad. And also you have, they buried a child, and sometime later they buried a mother, and by coincidence the mother happens to be shielding and protecting the child. People are not buried that way. The Holocaust was so bad that nobody would come in and reclaim the bodies, and nobody ever came back in to bury the bodies, and even the animals would not scavenge the place. Which is my take on it. Now again, you can disagree with that, because I cannot nail the lid on a coffin to actually prove the point that I'm making. All right. Let's see. Once I get, I'll think of a whole bunch of other comments. But again, why did I pick this topic? Because to me, I think it's extremely important to realize our ancient ancestors were brighter. Oh yeah, now I know about were brighter than we are. Now, there was one pupil, and I don't know who it was. I don't even want to know who said it. Well, there's the writings, but I don't pay any attention to those ancient writings. There was fooing on everything the ancients said in their writings. You can believe that if you want to, but someday people might look back on us, and when we start talking about nuclear holocaust and nuclear war or Adolf Hitler, such a man did not exist. Fooey on those ancient people who said that shows they were ignorant. Or when they are living in caves and they start reading some of our writings on our inscriptions that talk about automobiles and see our models of airplanes and whatever, and say, hey, these people were ignorant, they didn't fly, because flying can't be done. Yes?
If there's a nuclear blast, then how could they not just go to mud?
Okay, mud. Now, I think I explained this the other class more than this one. I think that it was a different kind of nuclear bomb than we use. All of you know what I'm talking about when I talk about you can put a cold sandwich in a microwave, turn it on for a minute and heat it up, and the sandwich will not be altered in shape, but it will be heated, sometimes pretty greatly. Now, they used a lot, hey, the bombs we used at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, right within minutes after the blast, some people were able to actually walk over the blast there. Now, eventually they got sick from radiation. But there you're talking about a blast where nuclear reactions decay over time. It's called half-life. This blast had so much radiation to it that I think it could melt a human body or turn a human body into plastic who was actually inside a chamber trying to protect himself. They're inside a shelter. That's what they found the body, inside a chamber. And everything had been turned to plastic. They were using more than the blast radiation. And again, that explains why the bricks were burned on one side, but the walls were not knocked down, because, yes, there was a blast. The crater made it. But I want to remind you of something else, folks, about disasters like that. Go ahead. Okay. Now, this is you're getting ahead of me. Here's my next point, folks. I was in the Army for 6 years. And one day we were playing with mines. I mean, you gotta be careful doing that. We got this mine that was pointed at a fake soldier, and I saw this. It went off, and we just knew the fake soldier would have been torn to bits. He wasn't even touched. Now, this may sound, but I want to remind you something. We talked about this time, we talked about tornadoes. There have been many a case where a tornado will take away a house and leave its porch completely unhurt, unscathed. Now, some of you nodding your head. Or certain tornadoes can sometimes drive straw into a telephone pole. I mean, you try to put a piece of straw into a telephone pole, it doesn't work. But it actually drives, it can be highly unpredictable about the way it damages. It can damage this area really, really badly. That was actually far from the tornado, and the center of the tornado itself, no problem. You cannot predict how, in the case of the assassination of JFK, where they talk about the magic bullet, but the bullet, when a bullet hits a man's head, there is no way to predict what's going to happen to it. And there was one case where a man was riding in a car, and every witness said, oh, there was only one shot fired. The shot was fired. They all knew it was fired from the side, hit the side of the head. A bullet of a man riding a car hit the side of his head, and it knocked out the hole in the front windshield and knocked out a hole in the back windshield, and every witness said there was only one shot. Because when a bullet hits, of course, it's spinning, like so, and it sends the bone fragments every which way, and you cannot tell where it's going to be. That's why, these people talk about the magic bullet, the one that hit Connolly, how there could have been 3 shots fired. Hey, in the case of Robert Kennedy's death, there were only 8 shots fired, and they found 12 bullet holes. So I asked, how can that be? Number 1, the bullet shatters when it hits human flesh. Number 2, the bone fragments shatter, and they create effects like a bullet. The fact is, you cannot predict, and afterward, when it's over, you cannot tell what kind of damage a certain thing like a bomb, if it were nuclear, would have done. Especially since we do not know what kind of bomb they had, but I think it was high radiation, the type that we use in the microwaves. That would, all right, most of them have never heard of the neutron bomb. We were afraid of it. The neutron bomb was supposed to be able to kill all life in an area without damaging the buildings. None of you ever heard of it, I guess. You have, yeah. Neutron, because it would create a type of radiation that would penetrate walls and destroy all life, animal and plant and human, and leave the buildings intact so that when the radiation died down, you could go in and take over the buildings and live. That was the neutron bomb. Yes?
So another question is, where would they have the space to conduct the experiment? Or was it just an accident?
Now, what's the question again?
Where would they have like a building to conduct an experiment? Or do you think that it was all an accident?
Oh, well, in our case, our bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not accidents. We did a lot of our testing underground. And then we used an uninhabited area of New Mexico, white sands, to test this stuff above.
No, I'm talking about Mohenjo-Daro.
Now, are you asking where did they test it out?
Like where could they, like what building could they have used to test out if they had nuclear weapons?
They could have tested out anywhere else, anywhere on the Earth, and then carried them there by means of missiles or aircraft. We tested our nuclear. We tested our nuclear in white sands, New Mexico, and then dropped the bombs far away, 10,000 miles away in Asia. So why couldn't they have tested it in one part of the world and then dropped them in another part?
I just can imagine having a bomb like that, only using it one time.
Well, again, wait. I tried. The first thing I said to you this morning, was there's evidence that this has occurred all over the globe on every major continent.
Yeah, but I would think there would be a lot more powerful nation. There would be, civilization that would be in history books as one of the.
It's there, but we don't believe it. Okay, no, it is there. The records are there.
Okay.
Again, but we don't believe them.
Oh, okay.
The records are there. And I can say somebody in one of the classes said, I just don't put any stock in ancient writings. Well, I put a lot of stock in the book, quite a bit. All right, any other comments? Okay, good discussion. Anyway, now, for those of you who turn in your papers late, that's fine. I will dock 5 points for folks. That is far, far better than getting a 0. Do the math. Okay. Now, I believe I got to feudalism last time, if I'm right. where the system, a feudal system, was brought about in Europe as a result of the decay in central authority. In other words, the kings, for a while, each king was dividing his kingdom among his more than one son. So if a king had 3 sons, he'd divide his kingdom among 3 sons. And after a while, the king had no real authority, and there was no strong central authority. So the nobles took over, and they created what we call a feudal system. The word feudal means you have a king, but he has no real authority. He's a figurehead. And the real power lies in the hands of the nobility. Your dukes, your counts. The nobles created a system of vassalage. Now, when I was in high school, my brother checked out a book on the Crusades, and I'll never forget the opening line. My brother and I spent some time discussing it. The opening line in the book says, if you had lived in Europe during the Middle Ages, you would probably have been somebody's vassal. Everybody in Europe was a vassal. The king was vassal to the Pope. The Pope was a vassal to God. And then the dukes were vassals to the king. The counts were vassals to their dukes. The knights were vassals to their noblemen. And the serf was a vassal to his nobleman. Everybody practically was a vassal. The word vassal means you submit yourself to someone in authority. And you do that by swearing an oath called an oath of fealty. And you'd swear an oath of fealty by the nobleman you'd swear it to would be standing up. He'd hold his hands out like this. And you'd put your hands together and he would cover your hand with his hand. And you'd be bowing down. And you would promise to follow this nobleman to the ends of the earth if need be. Where he goes, you'd go, and you'll fight his battles. And in turn, he promises to protect you. You swear an oath of fealty to each other. The vassal did homage. During the ceremony of homage, that's where he did the oath of fealty. Now, the Middle Ages, they were really great for ceremonies. They just seemed to love their ceremonies. And they would have a ceremony called homage, and during that ceremony, the vassal would swear an oath of fealty to the noble. The lord owned a land, but he would grant certain amounts of land to this person. Now, we still have some of this today. I mean, we may think we own land, but actually the land is owned by the state. And the state has a right to take it over when they need to. For instance, if they need to put a road on your property. Now, the Constitution says they must pay a fair price for it, market price for it. But the Lord owned the land, and he would divvy out the land to whoever he will, so that this vassal would give this plot of land, and that vassal would give that plot of land. And the land was called a fief. Land given by the Lord. This was the fief, and you notice I wrote that in cursive writing. Now, something else. So, in return for the fief, the nobleman or the vassal was expected to pay a certain amount of his produce to the Lord. So he would pay whatever he produced. He'd give a certain percentage of that to his Lord to support his Lord. And something else about this, at the bottom now were the serfs. The serfs were not allowed to hunt. And this is one reason why in our country, I mean, you may not realize we pride ourselves on allowing ordinary people to hunt. Now, hunting is somewhat gone out of style, I guess, and that's why we have so many people hitting deer. I hit one myself about 4 years ago, and I had a student last year who worked for an insurance company who said it's just becoming a plague. We don't kill the deer, so they kill us. They kill us while we're driving along, yeah, I know. But, I mean, also, folk, if we don't thin the population a little bit, they're all going to starve to death because they're going to all eat all the food that's there. But we don't hunt anymore, but not many of us. Personally, I don't care for it because it's time consuming, but really much so. But then again, but we Americans would pride ourselves, and we just would say we allow anybody to hunt. But in Europe, in the Middle Ages, only the high up nobility were allowed to hunt. And again, the serfs were not allowed to fish without permission from the Lord. And if a serf fished, he was expected to first fill his noble's dish. That's a poem they had in our 6th grade book. When a serf goes out to fish, he must first fill his noble's dish. And the picture showed his, the Lord's, was full of fish, and mine empty of fish. But anyway, the serfs were, now, the serf was not a slave in that the only difference, folks, was serfs could not be bought or sold. Serfs were, they were property, considered property, but a lord could not sell one from one to the other. Europe prided itself on, oh, we have outlawed slavery, and they had outlawed slavery for centuries until they ran into some Africans and decided to enslave them. But for a long time, Europeans outlawed slavery, but they had in this place serfdom. The serfs were at the bottom of society. At the top of society, of course, were the royalty and the nobles. Now, another class of people were the knights. They figure into a lot of folklore. The word knight, as I mentioned before in connection with the Japanese samurai, the word knight means mounted horseman. Now, the Europeans figured out a way to breed better horses by mixing this breed with that breed, and they could produce bigger horses. But also something else I think figured in. The European men became smaller and smaller and lighter in weight as time went on. Now this was to change later. And folk, I don't think it was due to bad diet so much, it was due to inbreeding. European nobles would only marry other nobles. European royalty would only marry other royalty. And the average European would only marry in his community. And after a while, your Europeans got tinier and tinier and tinier. Then someone came to the United States. It wasn't we had better diet, it was just here in the United States, a Swede would marry a French person, and a Scotch might marry a British or someone, or basically we tend to marry over the horizon. And this is why that we got bigger than the Europeans, more so than then. Now, changing that today, a lot of your Europeans and Asians are married over the horizon. I'm old enough to notice that Asian people I see are bigger than they once were, and I think it's because they're marrying over the horizon. No, we're marrying strangers. That may not always be good for you socially, but it is good for your genes. To marry people that neither your kith or kin have ever seen or heard of. I did. My father did. Basically, that's what I mean by a stranger. Marry someone that you didn't even know growing up, and neither nobody in your circle of friends or family knew growing up, someone from hundreds of miles away. We tend to do that in this country. And it is good for us genetically. But the males, I think, became lighter in weight as time went on, and the horses became larger. So the stronger horses and the lighter men were able to carry an armored knight. The stirrup was invented. I'm not asking for a show of hands, but I suspect a lot of you might not even know what a stirrup is. Basically, a stirrup is something that dangles down from a horse's saddle that enables you to use it to mount a horse. Before the stirrup was invented, the knight was expected a squire. The squire would get down on his hands and knees, and the knight would step on the squire's back and mount his horse that way. But then the stirrup is what enabled a knight to use the stirrup as a means of getting onto the back of his horse. The stirrup was invented. For 500 years, knights dominated the battlefield. Seldom did a knight in armor get killed. The lords needed their knights, or knights needed their lords. Now, who became the knights? To become a knight, you had to be of noble birth. In other words, your commoners did not make it. You had to be the son of a nobleman. And oftentimes, maybe a nobleman might have 5 or 6 sons. The oldest one he'd give his own title to, and the other sons he'd make knights. Well, maybe one son would go serve the church, become an official in the church, but the rest of them would become knights. Between the ages of 6 and 14, the young knight was a page, served as a page. That is, he served in the palace of the nobleman or the palace of the king, running the errands of the king. He became a page boy. At 14, he became a squire. He went from page the squire. And at about 20 or 21, he'd become a knight in a ceremony called knighting. But as a squire, he'd learn how to hunt and learn how to handle weapons. Now, he would also be taught the arts of, and I want to elaborate in this term, of chivalry. When I was about 15, a sophomore in high school, in one of our classes, we debated whether or not chivalry was dead. But chivalry, we used to, it used to be that the man would open the door for the lady, and when he parked his car, he'd get out and open the door for a lady so that she could get in and out of the car, or help a woman with her wraps. A lot of these traditions and customs have passed off the scene these days. We don't do anymore. I must say, I kind of hate to see it go. But also, another thing about chivalry is, if you were crossing a log bridge and there was only room for one to get across, and you were the man, and there was a woman on the other side trying to get across, who would step aside? Who knows? When you're trying to get across the same bridge at the same time, a man on one side, a woman on the other, who's supposed to step aside and let the other person cross first? The man. All right, again, most of you seem to be lost in the dark. Supposedly the man would step to one side and let the lady cross. Now, if we're two men, the smaller man would step aside. Now, there's a story about Robin Hood. Robin Hood and Little John was bigger than Robin Hood, so when neither one would step aside and let the other cross. They met in the middle of the log, and Little John locked Robin Hood in the water. I mean, this is the way they settled the differences. But when there was a lady, the man would step aside and let the woman cross. Chivalry. Due to chivalry, the men used to pay for the date when they go on a date. This was changing about sometime before they married. Now, folks, you can decide what you want to believe, but when I'd been at Lockheed 7 years, I was still single, and I asked this lady to go to Stone Mountain. And when she found out she had to pay, she pulled out her money and said, "No, wait now, I'll pay." She said, "Oh, I'll pay." She was unemployed and been unemployed for weeks. I'd been at Lockheed for 7 years. I said, "I knew this would cost money when I brought you out here, and I'm willing to pay." We finally worked out a compromise where she paid part and I paid the rest. I went to Lockheed the next day to discuss it with one of my other single friends. And said, "Yeah, some of my girls do that to me, and I don't like it." I'm being honest with you, folk, and I've had male pupils in my class that they don't like it either. It's a woman's way of saying, "I'm not yours." All right. If any of you want to comment one way or another, your comment, I promise you no argument. I'll just listen.
I still think we have like chivalry today.
You still think we do?
Because like the guy pays for the majority of the stuff.
I think he should. Yeah. All right.
I think chivalry is dead not because of the men, but because the women nowadays think it's creepy. Like if I go on a date and I open your door, you're gonna be like, "What the hell?"
Yeah, it is.
But girls
you are right.
now, I'm sorry, but they don't appreciate things, and that's
They
why.
don't. Yeah,
Am
you're
I
right.
right?
Okay.
You're right.
Now, Alexander. Okay, one at a time. I'll get to you, Alexander.
So I went on vacation with a guy over New Year's, and he would not let me walk on the side of the street. He always had to be on the street side.
Yeah.
And I was like,
That's
this is. I was so not accustomed to it, but I love it, and I love the fact that he would open my doors and pay for stuff. And I teach my kids that I nanny for that they need to open my door and open any woman's door. So I don't think it's good.
I'll be right with you a minute. Hey, you had a comment. I'll be back here. Yeah.
Okay, chivalry is not that. I just the other day when I was to breakfast, the lady was having trouble opening the door, and I just ran for her around the meeting to open the door for her.
Yeah. Some women appreciate it, and some don't. Okay.
I think it depends on what your expectations are as a woman. Like, I expect for whoever wants to open the door for me. A lot of women don't know, so that's why some men don't want to.
Because the men, with all I'll being a man, you don't know whether you're sure or not. The customs are so undefined and so nebulous, you don't know, a man doesn't know what to do. Yeah.
I grew up like my parents like instilling in me that I can do everything that I want to do and not to like make someone else do it for me. So like, people like do, I guess, I don't know. I feel weird when people do stuff for me just because like I'm so independent, and like I'd rather pay for myself. I'd rather open my own doors. I'd rather like do all that stuff. But like I'm not saying that it's always weird, but like sometimes it's nice. But for the majority of it, I'm like way too like freaked out.
Like you wanna appreciate it $1,000 for your life.
She probably wouldn't think twice about it. She probably ignore you.
I helped a young lady move from one apartment to another one time many years ago. And I knew if she didn't have my help, she could not have moved some of her stuff. I mean, it's simply because being female. She was ordinary, she simply lacked the stamina to pick up some of the furniture that needed to be picked up. Simply lacked it. And if I think you can do anything you want to do, and maybe that's great to be independent. I was that way somewhat myself. But, yes.
How long have you been married for?
26 years, to be 27, come September 24th. My anniversary, September 26 years. I mean, okay, I didn't get married until I was 39. I got married.
How come?
I blame no one but myself. No, it's not that I was smart. It's just that I would foolishly stay in a bad, sour relationship much too long, and I'm watching some of my daughters do the same thing. Something that I should have gotten up and either walked away from or ran from, I'd stay in. And looking back over on it, I mean, I have kept a journal since 1967, and I wrote something really bad in my journal one time. I always blame the girls. No, the problem I realize by now. And until I realized I was the problem, my life didn't come together. I have met the enemy, and it is me. So if you're going through one failed relationship after another, you really ought to take a look and seriously, critically examine yourself. Because, I mean, if it's just one, hey, it's probably their fault. But if it's one after another, it might be that, but if it's one after another, folks, the problem likely is you. Me. All right, I want to be nodding your head. In my case, the problem was me. Yes.
What was your problem?
Staying in the relationship too long that wasn't working, it wasn't going to work, or pursuing a woman for too long who was not interested.
So like she like suckered you in and you just couldn't get out.
And I didn't get out. Yes.
Oh, well, I was there.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of men are, and I didn't get out.
Well, I'm glad you got out. You seem happy.
Oh yes, thank you.
Still got some
But my
color in
life
here.
did
You're
not
still
come
good.
together until I realized, folk, and a lot of you might have come to that point, the enemy, my worst enemy, is me. Now, of course, I talked to a man one time many years ago, and he was having trouble with his relationship, and he said, I don't know if it's my fault or hers, but he was hoping it was his fault. Because it was his fault, maybe he could do something to correct it. The actual real issue was it was her fault. By the way, this woman never is married, and she's now about 62. She never married. But the whole issue was her fault. Where he was wrong was he didn't get out of it. Just like me, same problems I had. All right. But anyway, all right. Good discussion. Anybody else? All right. Is chivalry dead? Each of you can decide for yourself. And tonight's we're taught the arts of chivalry. Now, I'll say this about chivalry. The knights were to treat women with courtesy, but only women of their own class. Seldom a woman who was born to as a serf he wouldn't show respect to. Now, folk, I really strongly believe that one of the reasons that Europe rose higher than the other societies, at least in the 15 and 16 and 1700s, was because, to me, Europeans treated their women better than anyone else. And I had a woman say, but Europeans taught that women were subjected. Yes, women were to be subjected to men, but the men were told, you must respect them. And this, I mean, to me, this is the key. Now, the worst thing that society can do is make their women equal to men. I've said that more than once, folk. I mean, some of them have said the worst thing. I mean, some of the ways that the men have treated women, killing them when their husband dies, I mean, like some societies have done, requiring them to throw themselves in a fire when a husband dies, or treating them as property, treating them as sex objects. All this is bad. Nothing is worse. Killing unwanted female babies. I mean, this is something other societies have done to the women, but nothing is worse than making the women equal. That's a short story. What's that?
What's your reason?
I had someone ask that before. And basically, all right, when they will take charge and run the show. Well, the problem with that is, what's wrong with that? Okay,
What's wrong with that?
they'll run it to the ground. They'll run the society. See, without that meaning to it, they run it to zero. Women think with a different side of the brain than men do. This is now known to be true. All right, if I'm not seeing all, but just look at your history book, folks. And I pointed out to you, the Arawak Indians, I'll get you a comment. The Arawak Indians did this. The American Indians did this. The African people did this.
There's been men that have girls.
Sometimes the men just won't take the lead. Okay, yeah.
So you're saying it's better to kill and objectify women?
That sounds terrible. That sounds horrible. That sounds awful. That sounds gross. That sounds horribly bad. But I'm going to either stand or fall on having said it. Because, I mean, the Chinese created I'm pulling on a China now. The next best society that a man ever had, second only to the Europeans. And they treated their women awfully. But they at least didn't allow them to take charge. There's another group, I won't even call their name, but they believe that women are property of men and should obey a man no matter what. They created the third best society behind the Chinese and the Europeans. I mean, what I said, I mean, I know it sounds bad. I'm sorry, folks. I've got to go with what I've observed and never mind where the chips fall, yeah.
You think a woman could be like a world leader, like president of the United States?
Okay.
Like Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
Clinton.
There are some who might qualify. Yes, I think so. One could. I mean, hey.
But she's going to be the leader of the free world. I mean, she's
Okay.
she's
Here and there. Here and there. We've had some women who made great queens. Elizabeth I of England was such a woman. To some extent, Catherine, Catherine, had some really, really weird problems. I don't even know if that's... we have had a few who have risen to the occasion. Margaret Thatcher. Oh, yeah, Margaret Thatcher. Really good. If she actually, folk, is qualified, I say don't hold her, let her take the lead. All right.
She would not only run the country, she would
All right.
run her.
If she can do it.
But you just...
But most of the time, all right, when you make them as a whole class equal, as a whole class. I mean, one individual who can, if she can, Joan of Arc served as a general in King Charles VII's army. We'll talk about her later. And won every battle she faced until she finally got caught. She was what France needed. Let her. But don't make it a policy just to create them, to put them ahead of men just because they're women. They have to earn it, have to prove it.
But not...
Even put them ahead if they're capable of doing it. I mean, hey, in the Bible there was a female judge in Israel who led her people to victory over their enemies who had been oppressing them. I mean, it's there. It's there. If she can do it, yes.
Looking back in the Bible.
But I'm going to try to make a distinction. One individual, let her go as far as she can. I mean, if she can become the greatest scientist, if she can become a nuclear scientist, don't hold her back because she's a woman. If she can become a computer programmer, don't hold her back because she's a woman. But don't promote her over men just because she's female, and you have to create equality. And that's what we're doing. Okay. All right, there is a difference. Okay, yeah. Yeah, there is a huge difference, folks. All right, I know I've made a bunch of people upset at me. I'm sorry. But again, if I don't step on toes, I haven't done my job. You're all adults. You can decide what you want to decide. But one of the things I learned as a freshman college, a professor is supposed to pry open, closed, complacent minds and is supposed to step on toes. Do any of your teachers step on your toes? If they don't, they're probably not doing their job. I don't see the... all right. I mentioned, all right, at the top of the society was the nobility, kings. At the top, underneath them were the dukes. We might call them governors today. If modern America were set up on we'd have a king in Washington, And then under him, each state would have their own duke. The Duke of Georgia, the Duke of Tennessee, the Duke of Alabama, the Duke of New Hampshire, whatever. Then under the dukes would be the counts. The Count of DeKalb, the Count of Cobb, the Count of Paulding. Okay. There's too many private conversations going on. I mean, this is not a elementary school class. And the Count of Cobb, the Count of Paulding. I mean, then the lower nobility would be the Viscounts. At the bottom, Great Britain had its earls, which was likely equal in rank to a count, the earl or the marquis. Now, the knights also would engage in sham battles called tournaments. Now, right here in Metro Atlanta, just south of the city, we have a Renaissance festival where we practice tournaments, where they still do fake tournaments. Basically, a tournament was where you get two knights galloping toward each other full speed, each with a shield and spear, and the knight would try to use his spear to knock the other knight off his horse. Any of you ever seen that done or know about it?
That's how
Yeah, Renaissance 2000, or Renaissance Festival. If any of you have been to that, yes, my wife and I have been to a couple of them, but not recently. And I was carrying a camcorder one time and had a friend come up and said, if you don't put that camcorder under cover, it's going to get dust. And I felt like saying to him, hey, if I cover it up, I can't take pictures with it. It would have gotten dust. Now, of course, today, these newer cameras, they're not going to get dusty anyway. They have no moving parts. But then again, when you cover it up, you can't use it. If you get it out, it's going to get dusty. What do you want to do? Well, I'd rather it get dusty so I could get the pictures. I still have the pictures I took of these knights going at each other full blast and knocking each other, trying to knock each other off the horse. Sometimes they'd have teams. Now, a lot of knights were permanently crippled as a result of this, and finally kings just decided that they could not tolerate the loss of valuable manpower. But because a knight might get permanently his spine severed or pelvis broken, and they didn't have ways to fix those problems in those days. Women, they were supposedly under control of men. However, a lot of times their husbands were away at war, and that was left to the woman to manage the estate. So women were left to manage, and she had to learn how to be skillful at managing money and managing servants. And again, something else about women too, folk. The worship of the Virgin Mary tended to elevate the status of women among Europeans. And Mary was worshipped as the Mother of God. Whether she should have been or not, that's for each person to decide. But just stating a fact, Mary was regarded very, very highly by Europeans for hundreds of years. And some people would say that she, more than perhaps anything else, elevated the status of women among Western Europeans. Now, the most famous woman of the Middle Ages was a woman I had to read about when I was in college, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, her father was Duke, and as in those days, a person's death did not necessarily occur at old age. Yeah, they did have people reach, every generation I think reached 80 or 100. But death occurred pretty evenly at any age. It's 1 year old, 2 years old. Actually, it occurred disproportionately at one. But if you lived past your first birthday, you could easily die at 2, 3, 4, 5 in any year. But her father died young, his appointed making, and left the duchy to her because she was his only child. So she inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine. Her father was Duke of Aquitaine. She inherited it. And her domain was bigger than the domain of the King Louis VII. So when they arranged for her to marry King Louis, and when she married King Louis VII, that increased his domains by more than twice what it had already been. Well, here is a problem Louis VII had. Louis VII had been the youngest son of King Louis VI, the younger son. But Louis VI, to keep his domain together, put Louis VII in a monastery. And Louis VII became a monk at first. Then Louis VII's oldest brother died. And that meant that all of a sudden Louis VII himself was heir to his father's throne, so they called him up a monastery. But he never got over the idea that he was a monk. And Eleanor said, I thought I was married king, and here I find I'm marrying a monk. She just simply did not like him in the least. She went on a crusade with him. He went on the Second Crusade, which I've mentioned. She carried 50 women with her. And these women, with these thousands of men, terribly misbehaved, including Eleanor herself. Well, according to your book, Eleanor was accused of having many affairs, but her husband finally divorced her after an affair with her uncle, and he said, this is just more like a stand. So he divorced her. Also, she had another problem, and folks, this may sound strange, but she bore him no male children. In other words, the king wanted to have a male heir, not a woman. Well, she only bore daughters. Now today, according to our present beliefs about reproduction, it's the father and not the mother who determines the gender. But in those days, they believed it was the mother who determined the gender. So a lot of times, your wealthier men would want to marry a woman who had a lot of brothers. In the belief, now this is silly, but nevertheless, they believed that a woman who had a lot of brothers was more likely to produce a male child than a woman who had fewer brothers. But anyway, of course, she had no brothers herself, but she only produced female children. So after King of France divorced her, Eleanor married the King of England, Henry II, and ironically, she bore Henry II 4 sons. One of them was King Richard, another one was Geoffrey, and the other was King John. We'll talk about them later, so keep these names in mind. But 2 of her sons became kings. And Louis then went on to marry someone else, and he wound up having one son named Philip Augustus, who became the best king France ever had. But anyway, Eleanor wound up, when her sons grew up, she became very tired of her husband Henry's numerous affairs. So basically, she traded one man in for a worse man. She traded in a man who would do the same thing to her that she had done to her first husband. And she led her sons into rebellion, and she was put in prison for a while. When her husband, King Henry, died, she was put out of prison. She lived to be in her 80s. And she was said, among other things, to be the inventor of romance. You might say, didn't romance exist? No, before this time, persons married because of convenience or because of, increase your husband's domains. You marry the wealthiest woman you can. It was marriage more for convenience sake. In the case of Eleanor, the modern Hollywood scene has been traced back to this woman. Here's the Hollywood scene for you, basically where the people swap companions regularly and go from one relationship to another. And the idea they have, now folks, don't think I'm teaching this, I'm just teaching about it. That love is only a feeling. The feeling will come, and then once the feeling goes, you'll never get it back. You follow your feelings. So if your feeling for a person goes, you go also. And you go wherever your feelings lead. Again, folks, please, I'm not teaching this. I don't believe this. But nevertheless, this is what we see. It went from her to Paris, France, to particularly Marie Antoinette and her husband, Marie Antoinette, wound up having her head chopped off in the reign of Louis XVI. But it went to Paris. Actually, it went from Paris, and instead of this scene, went to Hollywood. But you follow where your feelings lead. And again, this was seemingly the way that she lived. And before this, hardly any woman had lived by this kind of a standard. Just follow your heart and get dashed to pieces. But that's another issue. All right. Leaving that topic, but again, she was one of the more famous women of the Middle Ages. Well, the power of kings was greatly reduced, but kings would try to increase the power through alliances or through marriage or through wars. particularly the kings of France. So Louis VI, here's the way he increased his power. He got the throne, and he was nothing more than a mere figurehead. But there was a certain nobleman who was exceptionally wicked. I don't want to go into detail about his many heinous crimes. Well, Louis VI said this would be a good nobleman for me to pick on, so he sent his army and brought down this nobleman's castle, and the other nobleman did not say a word against it. But once he'd taken care of that really wicked nobleman, he picked on another one who was a shade less wicked than he was. When Louis VI died and passed the throne on to Louis VII did some of the same thing. He made war against a particularly wicked nobleman. The idea was to slowly and gradually build up the power of the kings and to make the nobility know there is a powerful king in France. Now, in the case of Louis VII, though, with all respect, I mean, I've already mentioned how that he came out of a monastery. When he went to war, I mean, he'd read in the Bible where that the king was supposed to bear the sword. So he said, I'll take the sword. And he surrounded the city and set the city on fire, which the city was rebellious. So I guess he had, by all accounts, he probably had every right to do that. But then when he heard the hideous screams of people who were being burned alive inside the city, it haunted him the rest of his life. He couldn't get it out of his mind. So to get it out of his mind, he went on a crusade to try to appease his conscience. Basically, he was trading in one war for another, but thought, well, I'll make war against God's enemies. That was his term on mine. I'll make war against God's enemies because the Pope has said this will earn me points and I'll atone for my misdeeds. But nevertheless, he did increase the power of the kingdom. His son, Philip Augustus, whom I'll mention later, turned France over into a powerful kingdom. Marriage, again, I've already mentioned how that Louis VII tried to increase his power by his marriage with a powerful woman, Eleanor. It did not always work, but they would try to increase their power through marriage. Eventually, money came back into Europe, slowly and gradually, and a lot of it, folk, may have come from Africa instead of coming in from China. But gold and silver coins began to find their way into Europe. I will say this. A lot of kings, particularly the King of England, brought Jews into their country because it was said that the Jew was like a sponge, and put the Jew into any economic situation, he would absorb all the money in it, just like a sponge absorbs water. And in other words, the King of England brought the Jews in hopes that they would raise enough money to where he'd get taxes from them and enrich himself. Other kings got the same idea, but eventually another later King of England expelled the Jews from England. And eventually the Jews found themselves being kicked out of various places, until eventually the Jews found themselves unwelcome in Spain, Portugal, France, England, and all of Western Europe. So they wound up moving to Poland. And you know the rest. They set themselves up for the big Holocaust that occurred in World War II. Yes?
Why were the Jews chased out of each European country?
Okay. This is, I mean, folks, I want to remind you, my wife is Jewish. And I am not in any way anti-Jew. But you ask a question, that this is a history class, and it deserves a good answer. The main reason was they did not believe that Jesus Christ was the promised Messiah. That's it. Basically, they would not convert to Christianity. Now, some did. But the basic reason was they were accused of having killed Jesus Christ. Now again, this is historical fact. It's not my opinion in any way, but it's historical fact. They were accused of having killed Jesus, and they were accused of being Christ's enemies, so they were hated. And they wound up moving into Poland and Germany, and this, folks, set them up to be slaughtered by the millions during World War II. All right, England. Uh-oh, and I'm out of time. All right, I must take up with this on Wednesday. England and the Way of the Conqueror. There's a personal one. I want to elaborate on him a little bit. And I recall discussing another teaching. You get to a topic where you have about 2 minutes left, and I want to spend more time with it. But, England, of course, you may know, is the home of where a lot of Americans came. In fact, the initial Americans that came from Europe came from England. You all know that, and I have roots in England myself. Some of you might not, but I have roots in England. So All right, anyway, the message you just saw on the board, take heed to. Everybody have a good couple of days, and I'll see you on Wednesday.